It's a story that defies everything we think we know about treasure hunting and the lengths people will go to chase their dreams. What marine surveyor Jake Morrison discovered on that foggy October morning in a forgotten Maryland marina would lead him down a rabbit hole of maritime mysteries, Spanish colonial history, and ultimately to a revelation that would change his life forever. This is a tale that proves sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found where X marks the spot, but in the journey itself. In this story, we'll dive deep into the meticulous detective work that turned a pile of yellowed nautical charts into the key to unlocking a 300-year-old mystery. We'll examine each clue, follow every lead, and reveal how one man's curiosity about an abandoned sailboat became an obsession that would consume 2 years of his life. It's a lesson that every adventurer needs to learn about the difference between chasing dreams and living them, and how sometimes the real treasure isn't gold at all. Jake Morrison had been surveying boats for insurance companies for 15 years, and he thought he'd seen everything the Chesapeake Bay could throw at him. Rotting hulls, boats filled with everything from decades-old fishing gear to the personal belongings of owners who'd simply walked away from their maritime dreams. But nothing had prepared him for what he found aboard the 38-foot Morgantown island called Esperanza that gray morning at Sunset Harbor Marina. The marina owner, Bill Hendricks, had called Jake about the boat 3 weeks earlier. The slip fees hadn't been paid in 18 months, and they needed an assessment for the lien process. Owner just disappeared, Bill had explained over the phone. Name was Thomas Delacroix, paid cash for 2 years up front, then vanished. Boat's been sitting there ever since, and frankly, it's becoming an eyesore. Jake pulled up to the marina at 7:30 in the morning, his surveyor's toolkit in the back of his pickup truck and a large coffee in his hand. The October air carried the smell of salt and decay that every old marina possesses, a mixture of creosote, diesel fuel, and dreams deferred. Slip D14 was at the far end of the marina, where the forgotten boats went to die. The Esperanza sat low in the water, her once white hull now stained green, with algae below the waterline. Her rigging hung loose, and her mainsail, only partially furled, flapped sadly in the morning breeze like a surrender flag. But what struck Jake immediately was how well-maintained everything else appeared. The teak decks, though weathered, showed signs of recent care. The stainless steel hardware gleamed despite months of neglect. This wasn't a boat that had been abandoned out of neglect. This was a boat whose owner had simply vanished. Jake stepped aboard and immediately noticed something unusual. The companionway hatch was secured not with a simple padlock, but with a complex brass lock that looked antique, almost ceremonial. After 20 minutes with his lockpicks, a skill he'd learned during his brief stint as a locksmith in college, the mechanism finally gave way. The interior of the Esperanza took Jake's breath away. Instead of the typical cramped utilitarian layout of most cruising boats, the cabin had been completely customized. Built-in shelves lined every wall, and these shelves were filled with books, hundreds of them, maritime history, Spanish colonial records, archaeological texts, and diving manuals. But it was the chart table that made Jake's pulse quicken. Spread across the large mahogany surface were dozens of nautical charts, some modern, others that looked centuries old. They covered everything from the Chesapeake Bay to the Caribbean, but they weren't arranged randomly. Someone had spent considerable time organizing them, marking them, cross-referencing them. Red string connected pushpins on various charts, creating a web of connections that spoke of obsessive research. Jake ran his fingers over the charts, noting the careful pencil notations in the margins, the highlighted depth soundings, the circled coordinates. This wasn't the work of a weekend sailor. This was the research station of someone who had turned treasure hunting into a science. In the center of it all, weighted down by a brass sextant, was a chart, unlike any of the others. The paper was thick and yellowed, the coastlines hand-drawn in fading brown ink. Across the top, in elaborate script, were the words, Mapa de los Tesoros Perdidos de Nueva Andalucía, Año de Nuestro Señor, mid-1692. Jake's high school Spanish was rusty, but he could make out enough. Map of the Lost Treasures of New Andalusia, Year of Our Lord, 1692. The chart showed the Chesapeake Bay, but not as Jake knew it. The coastlines were different, more approximate, and the depth soundings were marked in Spanish fathoms. But what made his heart race were the symbols scattered across the map. Small crosses, each accompanied by notations in what appeared to be a mixture of Spanish and some kind of code. One symbol, larger than the others and circled in red ink that looked fresh, was located in what Jake recognized as the Patuxent River, about 30 miles south of Annapolis. Jake spent the next 4 hours methodically photographing every chart, every notation, every piece of research materials he found aboard the Esperanza. In a waterproof case beneath the chart table, he discovered Thomas Delacroix's personal journals. 3 leather-bound volumes filled with meticulous research notes, translations of Spanish colonial documents, and detailed plans for what appeared to be a major salvage operation. The journals told the story of a man consumed by a singular obsession. Delacroix had been a professor of maritime archaeology at George Washington University until 2018, when he'd taken early retirement to pursue what he called the greatest treasure story never told. According to his research, a Spanish treasure galleon called the Nuestra Señora de la Esperanza had been deliberately sunk in the Chesapeake Bay in 1692 to prevent its cargo from falling into the hands of English pirates. But this wasn't just any treasure ship. Delacroix's research suggested that the Esperanza had been carrying not just gold and silver, but a collection of Aztec artifacts that Spanish colonists had been secretly smuggling out of Mexico to prevent their destruction by religious zealots. The ship's manifest, which Delacroix claimed to have found in the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, listed items of inestimable cultural and spiritual value to the indigenous peoples of New Spain. Jake read through the journals with growing fascination. Delacroix had spent 3 years tracking down every reference to the Esperanza in colonial records, Spanish naval archives, and even Jesuit missionary reports. He'd hired linguists to translate coded messages, consulted with experts in Spanish colonial history, and eventually acquired what he believed to be the original treasure map through a private collector in Madrid, who claimed it had been in his family for centuries. The research was impressive, but what struck Jake was how Delacroix's writing style changed as the journals progressed. The early entries were academic, measured, filled with careful analysis and scholarly skepticism. But as the months passed, the tone became more urgent, more desperate. By the final entries, dated just 2 months before the boat was abandoned, Delacroix was writing about destiny, about being chosen to find the treasure, about how the discovery would rewrite history and restore sacred artifacts to their rightful place. The last entry, dated March 15th of the previous year, was particularly chilling. The signs are all aligning. The spring tides, the water temperature, the position of the stars, everything matches the conditions described in the original documents. I've located the exact coordinates using the trigonometric calculations from the 1692 map, cross-referenced with modern GPS coordinates. Tomorrow I dive. Tomorrow I fulfill my destiny. The ancestors are calling me home. Jake closed the journal and looked around the cabin with new eyes. This wasn't just an abandoned boat. It was a shrine to obsession. Every book, every chart, every piece of equipment spoke to years of single-minded focus on one goal. But where was Thomas Delacroix? That afternoon, Jake called Bill Hendricks to ask about the boat's owner. Strange fellow, Bill recalled. Quiet, kept to himself mostly, but friendly enough. Always working on his boat, always reading those old books of his. Said he was a retired professor, doing research. Last time I saw him was around March of last year. He seemed excited about something, said he was going out for a historical verification dive and would be back in a few days. Never saw him again. Did you report him missing? Jake asked. Well, I waited about a week, then called the Coast Guard. They did a search, found no trace of him or his dinghy. His car was still in the marina parking lot. Coast Guard figured he'd had an accident diving alone. Happens more than you'd think. They searched for 3 days, never found a body. case was eventually closed as a presumed drowning. That evening, Jake sat in his own boat, the Delacroix journals spread before him, trying to make sense of what he'd discovered. The logical part of his mind, the part trained by 15 years of practical boat surveying, told him that Thomas Delacroix had been a delusional academic who'd convinced himself that a centuries-old fairy tale was real and had died pursuing an impossible dream. But another part of him, a part he usually kept buried under layers of professional skepticism, was intrigued by the sheer thoroughness of Delacroix's research. The man had been a legitimate scholar, with access to archives and resources that most treasure hunters could only dream of. His linguistic analysis was sophisticated, his historical methodology was sound, and his technical preparations for underwater salvage were remarkably professional. Jake found himself returning to the marina the next day, then the day after that. Each visit, he discovered new layers to Delacroix's research. Hidden compartments revealed underwater metal detectors, professional diving equipment, and detailed charts of the Patuxent River bottom. The man had been planning not just a treasure hunt, but a full-scale archaeological excavation. 3 weeks after his initial survey, Jake made a decision that would change everything. Using Delacroix's coordinates and his own boat, he would dive the site himself, not to find treasure. He wasn't that naive, but to solve the mystery of what had happened to Thomas Delacroix. Maybe he'd find some trace of the missing professor, maybe just peace of mind. But he had to know. The coordinates led to a deep section of the Patuxent River, about 4 miles from the nearest marina. Jake anchored his boat on a calm November morning and suited up in his diving gear. The water was cold and murky, visibility limited to about 10 feet. He followed his depth gauge down 40 feet to the muddy bottom, sweeping back and forth in a search pattern. At first, there was nothing but mud, silt, and the occasional discarded tire or piece of modern debris. But after 20 minutes of methodical searching, Jake's metal detector began to ping. Not the sharp, clear signal of modern metal, but the deep, resonant tone that suggested something large and old buried in the sediment. Jake began carefully excavating the mud with his hands, working slowly to avoid stirring up too much silt. What he uncovered made him forget to breathe for a moment. It was a cannon, clearly ancient, covered in centuries of marine growth, but unmistakably a cannon. And beside it, partially buried, the outline of what could only be the ribs of a ship's hull. Jake surfaced, his heart pounding with excitement and disbelief. Thomas Delacroix had been right. There was a shipwreck here, and based on the construction techniques visible in the hull timbers, it was certainly old enough to be from the colonial period. Over the next month, Jake made 7 more dives to the site, each time uncovering more evidence of a substantial shipwreck. The vessel had been large, probably over 100 feet long, and had been carrying considerable cargo. Jake found pottery shards, pieces of silver tableware, and even a few corroded coins that, when cleaned, bore Spanish colonial markings. But it was on his 8th dive that Jake made the discovery that would haunt him for months to come. Partially buried beneath a section of collapsed hull planking, he found a modern diving weight belt, and attached to it, a waterproof bag containing Thomas Delacroix's driver's license and a final journal entry written on waterproof paper. The note was brief but disturbing. I was right about everything. The ship is here, the cargo is extraordinary, but something else is here too. Something that shouldn't be. The artifacts aren't just treasure, they're guardians. The indigenous peoples didn't just hide these objects from the Spanish, they protected them with something else. Something that doesn't want to be disturbed. I can feel it watching me every time I dive. I can hear it calling. Tonight, I go down one last time. If I don't return, know that I found what I was looking for, and it found me too. Jake stared at the note for a long time, sitting in his boat as the November sun set behind the tree line. Thomas Delacroix had died here, that much was certain. But he died having proven his theory correct. The Spanish treasure ship was real, the artifacts were real, and the obsession that had consumed 2 years of Delacroix's life had been vindicated. Jake faced a choice that he knew would define the rest of his life. He could report the wreck to the authorities, let professional archaeologists take over, and walk away with the satisfaction of having solved a mystery. Or he could continue Delacroix's work, explore the wreck fully, and discover for himself what treasures and what dangers lay buried beneath centuries of Chesapeake Bay mud. The responsible choice was obvious. Jake called the Maryland Maritime Archaeology Program the next morning and reported the discovery. Within a week, the site was swarming with professional archaeologists, marine surveyors, and state officials. The shipwreck was confirmed to be the remains of a late 17th century Spanish vessel, and preliminary excavations revealed a cargo that exceeded even Delacroix's wildest expectations. The Nuestra Señora de la Esperanza had indeed been carrying Aztec artifacts, gold and silver ceremonial objects, jade carvings, obsidian weapons, and codices that provided new insights into pre-Columbian Mexican culture. The discovery made international headlines and was hailed as one of the most significant archaeological finds in North American waters. But for Jake, the real treasure wasn't the gold or the artifacts or the academic acclaim that followed. It was the lesson that Thomas Delacroix's story had taught him about the difference between pursuing dreams and being consumed by them. Delacroix had been right about the treasure, but he'd lost sight of what truly mattered. In his obsession to find artifacts from a lost civilization, he'd lost connection with the world around him. Jake testified at the coroner's inquest that officially closed the case of Thomas Delacroix's disappearance. The professor had died doing what he loved, pursuing knowledge and discovery. But he died alone, isolated by an obsession that had gradually cut him off from family, friends, and ultimately from life itself. The abandoned sailboat Esperanza was eventually sold at auction, but not before Jake spent one final afternoon aboard her, reading through Delacroix's research one last time. In a final journal entry that Jake had initially missed, hidden between the pages of a Spanish colonial history, he found Delacroix's real epitaph. "I realize now that I became so focused on finding treasure that I forgot to treasure what I'd already found. The real adventure wasn't at the bottom of the bay. It was in the research, in the discovery, in the passion for knowledge itself. I spent 3 years preparing to dive for 30 minutes. When I should have spent 30 minutes preparing to live for 3 years, the ancestors aren't calling me to join them beneath the water. They're calling me to honor them by living fully above it." 6 months after the discovery, Jake received a letter from the Smithsonian Institution. The Delacroix collection, as the recovered artifacts had been named, would be the centerpiece of a new exhibit on Spanish colonial America and indigenous resistance. Thomas Delacroix's research would be published posthumously, ensuring that his scholarship would outlive his obsession. Jake still surveys boats for insurance companies, but now he approaches each abandoned vessel with a different perspective. Every forgotten sailboat tells a story, and every story carries a lesson about dreams deferred, obsessions pursued, and the thin line between passionate dedication and destructive fixation. The real treasure that Thomas Delacroix discovered wasn't Spanish gold or Aztec artifacts. It was the reminder that the journey itself is more valuable than any destination, that the people we share our adventures with matter more than what we find at the end, and that sometimes the greatest discovery is learning when to stop searching and start living. The Chesapeake Bay keeps many secrets, but the story of the Esperanza teaches us that the most important treasures aren't buried beneath the water. They're found in the relationships we build, the knowledge we share, and the balance we maintain between chasing our dreams and appreciating what we already have. For those of you drawn to stories of maritime mystery and the lessons they teach us about the human spirit, remember that every adventure begins with curiosity, but should be guided by wisdom. The sea offers endless possibilities, but it also demands respect for both its power and its mysteries. Subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories about the treasures that lie not just beneath the waves, but within the hearts of those brave enough to seek them and wise enough to know when they've found them.